Well, okay. Uh, Old Testament survey, take two. It's good to see all of your guys' faces again. We really miss everybody. I don't know if Steve told you guys, but Janet was actually here last Sunday at our church. Um, and Nas cried and cried and cried when Janet left. It was so sad. We really miss you guys a lot. Um, well, a couple of things really quick before we start is don't forget. I believe Jeff sent the form to me, so I believe everybody picked a prophet and a day, right? I don't have that filled out form in front of me. I meant to print it out, but I didn't get a chance before this. Um, but uh, I think Jeff signed up. Kaylin was signed up for the second. I think it was right. So look, I just want to put this out here. Go ahead, Kaylin.
I was going to say, yeah, I signed up on the second, but Jeff said you would feel free to move that around. And I saw your call. We were in prayer. So you
Yeah.
can move me to the day that you need me on.
Well, how about this? This is uh maybe biting off more than you want to chew, but would you be willing to do March 12th, 1 month from tonight?
I can give it a try.
Okay, then you'll go on March 12th. All right, right on, man. If for some reason you go home and you think about it and that doesn't work, then let me know, and we'll see what else we can figure out. Um, okay, well, that said, let's jump into it. Um, Tonight, as promised, per last week, we are looking at creation and the period of the patriarchs. Um, and if you notice on the outline from last week, or the breakdown of Old Testament history, if you have that from last week, um, that period begins with creation and it ends with Israel and Egypt, with Joseph. Um, Genesis chapter 50. So basically, pretty much everything from Genesis 12 to Genesis 50 is the period of the patriarchs. Um, and just to kind of give you an idea of how we're going to approach this, I said last week that we're not going to, most Old Testament classes, at least ones that I've been in, um, they really just kind of cover the information that you're going to find in like your MacArthur Study Bible or the ESV Study Bible or something like that. It's all that information that's at the front of each book. Um, and I said last week that we're not going to do that. What I really want to do is kind of give us an idea of how uh, how events unfold over the course of the Old Testament era from creation all the way to Malachi. Um, it really gives you a different perspective of the Old Testament when you view it that way. Um, I think we kind of tend to get lost in the Old Testament because we don't have a good view of the chronology. You know, I I think a lot of us probably know what it feels like to be reading through Isaiah, and you're in Isaiah 48, or you're in Isaiah 62, and you don't know what that passage is referring to. Like, you don't know what's going on historically. It just kind of sounds like everything else that's in Isaiah. And what I really want to do is give us a little bit of a place to put our feet, so that hopefully some of that fogginess is resolved. Um, and so, what we're going to be doing each week is really just focusing on the highlights of the events. So, really, we're going to be looking at the beginning of a period. or the end of a period, and then one or two kind of key events or people or things uh, the, topics that are happening during that period. And so that's what we're going to be doing tonight. And a lot of this is going to be review, but hopefully some of it isn't. Um, well, that said, go ahead and take your notes and look at page 1 of week 2. And we're going to start by looking at creation. Um, so I'm going to try to like look up. I have my notes on the side. Let's see here. So that it looks like I'm actually looking at uh, you guys, because it kind of looks weird if you're looking at the top of my head. So it might look weird too if I'm not looking directly at you, but nevertheless, hopefully it helps the view a little bit. I mean, with this face, I need every advantage I can get. Let's be honest. All right. Section 1 is creation. So God created the world and everything in it out of nothing by his word and in 6 24-hour days. And then he rested on the seventh day. On the sixth day, God made man and woman in his image and he put them in the Garden of Eden. And God's original purpose was that humanity would populate the earth and productively manage it, reflecting God's own character and nature as Lord over all creation in their stewardship of the earth. That's God's purpose for humanity, that we exist in fellowship with him, and the way that God governs the universe, the way that he governs all things in his goodness and wisdom, and in all of his uh, holiness and character and attributes. Humanity, made like God in a number of ways, is managing and stewarding the earth as kind of a reflection of God's management of all creation. Uh, so to say that man is made in God's image means that God made man like himself in a number of ways. In theological terms, of course, it is God's communicable attributes as opposed to his incommunicable ones that humanity shares with us. I mean, in really simple terms, it means the ones that we can relate to or participate in. It's those attributes of God. You know, God hears, we hear. God is a communicator, we're communicators. God has emotions and rationality, and so do we. Um, we do not share God's. Uh, we do not share his infinity or his omnipotence with him. Obviously, those would be incommunicable attributes. Man was originally good, upright, and in fellowship with God, but because of man's disobedience and fall, God cursed man to enslavement to sin, estrangement from God, and enmity toward him, decay in life, physical death, and eternal destruction afterwards. Uh, and B, God cursed man, God cursed all of creation to futility and decay. Uh, the rest of the Bible really is the story of it's the record of God's redemptive work in restoring all things, and especially his elect, to that original purpose for which he created them. The age of the earth is unknown, though most conservative estimates are that the time of creation was about 6,000 years ago, or roughly 4,000 BC. Uh, the location of the Garden of Eden is also unknown, but based on the description in Genesis 2, verses 10 through 14, the Garden of Eden appears to have been somewhere in the Fertile Crescent. And that's an interesting footnote down there, footnote 2, of the known entities uh, in that passage. The Tigris and the Euphrates are obviously the general borders of Mesopotamia, which Moses points out in verse 14. And Cush was a region in northern Africa that ran along the Nile from Ethiopia to Egypt. And that leads many to believe that the Gihon River is actually the Nile. Of course, nobody knows, but somewhere in the Fertile Crescent is where the Garden of Eden clearly was. And we're going to look at that more in a second. Uh, but does anybody have any thoughts or comments or questions about creation before we move on? Okay. All right. Um, so section 2, the world of
Hey
the
there.
patriarchs. Yeah,
Sorry to
go ahead.
interrupt
Go
you.
ahead.
So I
Yep.
just want to clarify a point. When you say that man was originally created, will you say that he's in a state of innocent where he's good because he hasn't done anything wrong, or you say that he's in a state of righteousness?
Well, he's in a state of righteousness because sin isn't in the picture yet.
But righteousness is the reward of faith or obedience, right? As in doing something and then you're proclaimed right? Or is it something that's inherent in the natural state?
Well, yeah, it was inherent at creation. I mean, there's no like justification in the sense that we talk about it. You know, you're declared righteous uh, in spite of the fact that you're a sinner. Um, like it has no coherence at creation. Like man is created upright and he's righteous and he's without sin because that's the way God made him. And the the absence of that righteousness is the result of the fall.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Another
Uh,
question. Hold on.
yeah, yeah. Go ahead.
Okay, Tony, he says God's original purpose was that humanity would populate the earth and effectively manage it,
Yeah.
reflecting on his own character as Lord and creation of the earth. And then obviously we had the fall,
Mm-hmm.
and it sounds like to me in one respect God had to backpedal and figure out how to do this, but he is a sovereign God, and he should have known that that was going to happen.
Yeah. Well, I'll see you and raise you and say that he did know that that was going to happen. As a
Yeah,
matter of fact, I'll even I'll take it a step further and say that that was part of the plan from eternity past in the mystery of the wisdom of God. I think that was part of what he ordained all along. And but um, from a temporal perspective, there was a, what do we say, kind of shift in the approach. You know, yeah, I think some of the guys who are sitting there right now, Frank, I know Dave was there, Rob Milborn was there when we had the intensive study a couple years ago, um, talking about uh, the the eternality of God. How does a God who is eternal? I mean, you got to think, okay, God is holding time and space and everything that exists in his hands in a sense. Like you and I think that seconds tick, and like it or not, seconds are ticking for God, but they're not. Seconds didn't exist until God created everything. So, in a sense, he holds everything in his hands. So, what's God's posture toward the past and the present and the future if he's holding it all in his hands? Like, what's his perspective? He stands in the same exact relationship to all time uh, as he as he does to all of it. Um, so, how does a God like that interact in with time and space and in time and space? I mean, talk about one of the mysteries of mysteries. That that's hard to know. Um, and really, that's what we're talking about when we're talking about God having to figure out what to do after man fell. Like, obviously, he doesn't have to figure it out, but it really is a mystery. But from a temporal sense, that was the plan. Uh, So God, in time and space, adjusts and sets out to redeem and to restore what was a, you know, practically speaking, a ruined plan. I feel like you set yourself up, like we set ourselves up for getting in trouble when we try to talk about these things like this on the fly and saying things that are heretical. But hopefully, I mean, hopefully that makes sense. Anybody have any objections to that? Thoughts? Okay. Um, the world of the patriarchs, roughly 2100 to 1804. The general dates that I gave you last week. What are those dates, by the way? Anybody want to take a shot at those 7 dates and names or events associated with those off the top of your head? You have 7 dates. You got the whole entire Old Testament, period, framed. Anyone want to take a stab at that? 2000, Abraham, right? Uh, 1800 is who? 1800 is
David in
Israel.
Egypt.
Israel and Egypt. 1400, Moses.
Moses.
1000,
David.
David. Next one, 722.
Is Assyrians defeat the northern kingdom. Israel.
Assyria defeats Samaria. Yep. The next one, 586.
The destruction of Jerusalem, Judea, the southern kingdom.
Yep. Destruction of Jerusalem, 586. The next one, 400.
Malachi.
Malachi, into the Old Testament period. You got those 7 dates. You got the entire Old Testament framed. So patriarchs, roughly 2100 to 1800. And the geography is Mesopotamia and Canaan. The key players are Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. And those guys are the patriarchs. When we're talking about the patriarchs, those are them. The word patriarch is a transliteration of the Greek, of a compound Greek word that literally means first father. So these guys are the first fathers, and it's Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. Those are the guys we're talking about. Job is also in this period, which we're going to end with tonight, which I think is really interesting. But if you go ahead and turn over to page 2, you can see kind of a map of the world of the patriarchs. The world of the patriarchs, literally the first fathers, begins with the call of Abraham in Genesis 12, and it ends with Israel and Egypt during the time of Joseph's service under Pharaoh in Genesis 50. Prior to the journeys to Egypt, which you guys know what I'm talking about there, it was during the famine. Joseph is already ruling. We're talking about the later chapters of Genesis, and Jacob and his sons make a few trips down to Egypt to get food to eat. A lot of these kinds of details, by the way, I'm just going to assume tonight and going forward that we're already familiar with that stuff. But prior to the journeys to Egypt, the entire geographical focus of the patriarchal period is on Mesopotamia and Canaan. And so here's a map of that world. You can see close to where ancient Babylon was, in the eastern Mesopotamian region. You can see Haran, where Abraham's family settled before his call. And then, of course, Canaan is roughly the area of modern day Israel, and biblical Israel. And then, of course, Egypt is down below in northern Africa. And it is this area minus Egypt that is in view in the patriarchal period. It's Mesopotamia, and then Canaan, and then of course, um, from Genesis 12 on, it's Canaan until you get down toward the end of Genesis, and then you're looking at Egypt, of course. There are several geographical points of note in the ancient Near East that were not only important during the patriarchal age, but throughout the Old Testament period. And we talked about this last week. Mesopotamia is the region between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. Mesopotamia is not only the original home of Abraham, he was from Ur, but it's the seat of the three greatest national powers of the pre-Hellenistic ancient world, namely the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and the Medo-Persians. When I say pre-Hellenistic, what am I talking about? Anybody got the mic?
Greece, Greek age,
Yeah, which was roughly what?
750 to 500.
Well, it's roughly 400 to 200. And yeah, and that's when Greek culture spreads across the Mediterranean world. Under Alexander the Great, he's the guy that kicks that off. But the pre-Hellenistic, by the way, if you haven't heard, uh, uh, that comes from the Greek word for Greece, Hellen, and Hellenistic just is, kind of a transliterated form of Greek, of the word Greek. So when we're talking about the pre-Hellenistic world, we're talking about the ancient world prior to Alexander the Great and the expansion of Hellenistic culture across the Mediterranean world. And so the first really great world powers before that are all in Mesopotamia. They're all in central and eastern Mesopotamia. That's the Assyrians first, then the Babylonians, and then the Medo-Persians. Um, the Fertile Crescent is important. That name doesn't appear in the Bible, um, but the region is the stage in which the entire Old Testament takes place. The Fertile Crescent is a massive crescent-shaped area that stretches from the northwest coast of the Persian Gulf through Mesopotamia, down along the Mediterranean coast, and then along the Nile River region of northern Africa. Uh, the reason for its name is obvious. I mean, that whole part of the world is just a big, harsh desert, and the Fertile Crescent is a really kind of fertile area along two of the world's most important rivers, well, three of the world's most important rivers, and then down along the Mediterranean coast. The Fertile Crescent was a major travel route in the ancient world. So it's no surprise that when, for instance, the Babylonians, who were located all the way in eastern Mesopotamia, all the way over by Ur, where Abraham is from on that map, when they invaded Judah, the southern Jewish kingdom, in the early 6th century, they traveled along the Euphrates, and then they entered the land, Israel, from the north. I mean, you can see that on the map, can't you? So, uh, along those lines, it's also no surprise that Jeremiah, whose ministry focused on the impending judgment of God via the Babylonians, makes several dozen references to the judgment of God as coming from the north. The first one is in Jeremiah 1:13, and you have a couple dozen references through Jeremiah talking about judgment coming from the north. And that appears several other times in the prophets, even though the Babylonians were technically coming from the east. So that's why they're spoken of as coming from the north, or the people of the north. It's because they traveled along the Fertile Crescent and dropped down into the land from the north. Chaldea is another important name. That's the original home of Abraham's family, and later that's the kingdom of Babylon. Throughout the Old Testament, Babylonian and Chaldean, as well as Babylon and Chaldea, those are basically synonymous terms. Hebron, which is just south of Jerusalem, that was the eventual settling place of Abraham just after his call and arrival in Canaan in Genesis 3:18. And it was the capital city of Israel. It was an important city all the way through the reign of David, and a capital city of Israel at the beginning of David's reign. The first 7.5 years of David's reign, Hebron was the capital. That's one of the oldest inhabited cities in the world. It's really incredible to think about, but that was the Jerusalem before Jerusalem. Okay. Any thoughts or questions or comments about those things, the land, the geography, the general time period? Okay. Section 3, the call of Abraham. And this is where we're going to focus for most of the rest of the night. This is obviously the key event during the patriarchal period. There are a lot of other things that are important, but this really kind of dominates. Abram's family was originally from Ur in Chaldea in the eastern Mesopotamian region. And for reasons not specified, they set out for Canaan, but they settled in Haran, roughly 1,000 miles to the northwest. It was at Haran that God called Abraham. God's covenant with Abraham marks the first major development in the post-fall redemptive activities of God. He first announces the covenant to Abraham in Genesis 12, 1 through 3, but he repeats it to him 3 more times in chapter 13, chapter 15, and chapter 17. And then God repeats the covenant twice more to Isaac and to Jacob in chapters 26 and 28 of Genesis. Next page. The Abrahamic covenant, Genesis 12, 1 through 8, is when it's first announced. These are the major features of the Abrahamic covenant. God's promises to Abraham include a nation made up of his genetic offspring, that's Genesis 12, 2. A blessing to Abraham himself, fame or greatness for Abraham, a blessing to all nations through Abraham, and a portion of the land of the ancient Near East to Abraham's offspring. Later, of course, in Genesis 17, God changes Abraham's name from Abram, which means exalted father, to Abraham, which means the father of many. And he would give him circumcision. And both of those things are signs of the Abrahamic covenant. Geography. The geographical specifics of the land promised to Abraham are stated repeatedly in Genesis, and they include virtually the entire region of the ancient Near East, from the Nile all the way to the region of the Hittites, which that's kind of modern day Lebanon and Syria and southeast Turkey. It's that whole area along the Mediterranean north of Israel. That's the region of the Hittites. So it includes that. And then from the Mediterranean all the way to the Euphrates. And just so that we see this, why don't you go ahead and open up your Bible to Genesis 12. And this is something that I just kind of want to trace through over the next 9 weeks. Because this land and these people obviously are central to the Old Testament. They're kind of the focus of everything that's going on. From right here, from Genesis chapter 12 all the way to Malachi, the focus all the way in between is on Abraham and his descendants, the people of Israel, and this land that God is talking about. And that really starts here. But just so that we can see how very explicitly the geography is pointed out, to me it's pretty fascinating. So in Genesis chapter 12, in verse 1, you can see uh, now the Lord said to Abraham, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house, that's in Haran, right, to the land that I will show you. Okay, so Abraham goes and he believes God, and it's credited to him as righteousness, right? So he believes that God is gonna uh, bring him to a place, that he's gonna show him a land that he's gonna go to, and he believes him, and so he's righteous by faith. Which, by the way, uh, justification has always been by faith in what God says. People are responsible for believing what God has revealed, not for believing things that he hasn't revealed. And that is the basis of justification. In Abraham's day, the Messiah was not revealed. And so Abraham's not accountable for believing the specifics about the life or ministry of the Messiah. None of that's been revealed. What he is accountable for is believing the instructions that God has given him right here. And so far, the instructions are, hey, leave Haran and go to the place I'm going to show you. And Abraham says, okay. And it's right at that minute that he's justified. Today, people are responsible for believing that Jesus, God and man, Jesus, the eternal Son of God, dwelling in human flesh, died on the cross instead of sinners to pay the penalty for their sins, and that alone is able to reconcile us to God. And that's what people are responsible for believing today. And everything from Abraham, everyone from Abraham to now, uh, has been uh, obligated under that same exact dynamic. The basis of saving faith has always been belief in what God has revealed. John the Baptist believed what God had revealed. The Pharisees did not. John the Baptist was justified, and the Pharisees were not. Saving faith has always been on the basis of what God says. Okay, so nevertheless, Genesis 12, verse 1, God says, go to a land that I'm going to show you. And so Abraham goes. And then down in verse 7, it says, then the Lord appeared to Abram. Okay, so, well, Abraham goes down there and he's at Shechem. And the Lord says to him, to your offspring, I will give this land. Which land? It's the land that Abraham is in, the land he's standing on. Okay, turn over to Genesis 13, the next chapter, and look at verse 14. The Lord said to Abraham after Lot had separated from him, lift up your eyes and look to the place where you are, northward, southward, and eastward, and westward. For all the land that you see, I will give to you and to your offspring forever. I will make your offspring as the dust of the earth, so that if one can count the dust of the earth, your offspring also can be counted. Arise and walk through the length of the breadth of the land, for I will give it to you. There's very specific, explicit geography that's being talked about there, right? It's the land that Abraham can see in every direction, and it's the land that he can walk on. All right. Turn over to Genesis 15. This is the third time now that God is repeating this to him. And look at verse 18 of chapter 15. This, of course, is where God cuts the covenant with Abraham. Abraham separates the pieces, and God passes between them in the night. and there's in the form of a torch and a smoking pot. Uh, and then verse 18, on that day the Lord made a covenant with Abraham, saying, to your offspring I give this land from the river of Egypt. You know what the river of Egypt is? The river of Egypt is the Nile. This is the Nile River. The Hebrew word that's used there for that's translated here, the river of Egypt, that specifically refers to the Nile. So there's another river in the Sinai Peninsula that's called the Wadi of Egypt, or the Brook of Egypt, or like the Creek of Egypt. But this is not that river. This is the Nile River. So God says, I will give your offspring this land from the Nile to the great river, the river Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. And that whole area is Canaan and the Hittite region that we talked about earlier, north of modern day Israel. So, okay, so just turn back really quick and look on your map. Turn back to page 2. Okay, so it goes from the Nile to the Euphrates. And there's some special emphasis, a special time taken to mention the land of Canaan. So, what part of that geography did God promise to Abraham? It's basically the entire ancient Near East. Go ahead, Charles. You're going to say something?
I was going to say the crescent.
It's the Fertile Crescent. Yeah. Okay, so and and this geography is explicitly pointed out several times. You got a few verses there. Joshua chapter 1 is another place. Uh, you have several times in the Old Testament where the geography of that promise is pointed out, and it gives very explicit geographical features. Now, here's the important thing. Look at the last sentence under that second bullet point there. At no point have Abraham's descendants ever possessed all of that land. There are two Old Testament passages. You have a footnote there. I'm not going to go over it, but it's worth reading. There are two Old Testament passages that are important in this respect. And you can look at those. One of them has to do with Solomon. You know, Israel was the world power at the time of Solomon's reign. Small chips compared to the Assyrians and the Babylonians. But nevertheless, Solomon is collecting tribute from all the nations in the ancient Near East during his day. But that's quite a bit different than possessing that land. That footnote is interesting. I would encourage you to read it. But it really is something to consider that God explicitly points out the land that he's promising to Abraham, and at no point have those people ever possessed it. Something to think about. Okay, the conditions of the Abrahamic covenant. The promises to Abraham are unconditional. They include no conditions. So when God promises this land to Israel, he doesn't say it's not like the Mosaic covenant where God says, if you obey me, then you'll have all these blessings and you'll be my people and I'll be your God. None of those conditions are attached to the Abrahamic covenant. Two observations here. The text of the Old Testament treats the Abrahamic and Mosaic covenants as distinct. Therefore, one should not conflate the promises made to Abraham and the law given through Moses. I think that it would be a mistake to kind of lump all those together as part of the same thing, because uh, for one, never does the Mosaic Code add a single condition to the Abrahamic covenant. But for two, Paul will explicitly state later that the Mosaic Code, which came 430 years after the promises made to Abraham and to his offspring, they didn't negate those promises. You can go and see that for yourself in Galatians chapter 3. The promises that God has made to Abraham here in these initial chapters of the patriarchal period in Genesis are unconditional. God doesn't attach any conditions to them. Observation number 2. Circumcision was added. This is Genesis chapter 17. Circumcision was added after the Abrahamic promises were given as a sign of those promises, as well as a condition for participation in them prior to the institution of the New Testament covenant. What do I mean by that? Well, there are no conditions placed on the covenant, on the covenant itself, on the promises themselves. Um, but God does say in chapter 17, okay, your descendants are going to have to be circumcised in order to participate in this covenant. And if any of them don't, then they're going to be cut off. But the promise itself stands, and the conditions are not attached to it. You can see that spelled out in Genesis 17, and then Paul makes the same observation in Romans chapter 9. So that is the Abrahamic covenant, and those are its primary features. Does anybody have any thoughts or questions or comments about that?
Well, with circumcision, it sounds like you're cut off if you do, and you cut off if you don't.
What do you mean?
Well, if you don't participate,
Wah, wah. Dean just scrubbed that part of the video.
Okay, I have a real question,
Okay, go ahead.
even though it was a good laugh. I guess that's that YouTube delay for you. It didn't go through so fast. But so I know that you haven't touched on the other major events of the flood and the Tower of Babel, but in terms of
Yeah.
the cultural context, those are global scale or high state
Yes.
events.
Yep.
So the question I have is there anything that becomes cultural norms kind of on a global stage, and everybody kind of does this thing as a result of them all coming from the flood and them all being in a sense related to the tower? Is there some cultural things that
Yeah.
are consistent regardless of whether or not you are related to Abraham or come from some other line?
Yes. There are 2, and the focus is on the focus tonight, obviously, and for the next 9 weeks is really going to be on God's redemptive activities. And so that's obviously very important, what you're talking about. The flood is a worldwide flood. I believe that. And then somebody will say, well, how did all those animals fit on the ark? And I would say, well, it's God that we're talking about. And if the first 4 words of the Bible are true, then that's not really a problem. Neither the flood or the animals on the ark or anything else. And I think, just really briefly, what you see in the Tower of Babel, this is off the cuff, but you have people. So one of the features of like the psychology of mobs, I've read different kind of studies and documents from court cases and things like that from different mob events. And 2 of the features of a mob are that people are able to communicate and mobilize in mass almost instantaneously. And you kind of see that, like, it seems like in Philadelphia, they just burn the city down, whether their teams win or lose, no matter what championship it is or whatever. But as soon as the first guy lights a dumpster on, lights a trash can on fire, boom, the city goes up in flames and everybody follows. And mobs always work like that. And I do think that there is some kind of mob element happening at the Tower of Babel. And God's assessment of that is that, you know what, if these people can collaborate like this, there's no limit to the kinds of sin that people can commit. And there are one of the events that I've thought about in this kind of same vein is the massacre at Srebrenica. it's been like 12 years since I read about it, but it was in 96, I think it was, under Slobodan Milosevic. There was the massacre of like 7,000 or 8,000 Bosnian uh, Muslim men and boys in the span of like a week. And the night that it broke out was a mob. And you can read the court documents from those trials. It's really horrific. Um, but I really do think it's that kind of mob mentality that you have happening at the Tower of Babel. And the thing that God does to mitigate that is he eliminates their ability to communicate. Now, today, with technology, think about this. For the very first time in human history, what God undid at the Tower of Babel has been reinstituted for the first time in human history since the Tower of Babel. Human beings can communicate instantaneously with each other in any language from anywhere in the world. That's really something to think about. Um, Tim, I don't know. I'm like way off topic, and I don't mean to do this. Um, but the other thing that we have after the flood is the institution of some form of civil government. It's and and the first instance of it is capital punishment. Uh, if you kill, then it's your life in exchange. Um, that obviously is a really major development in kind of governing structures of humanity. Tim, I don't know if any of those actually deal with the question that you're asking, but uh, I kind of had a blank check, so those are my thoughts.
That's all right. We all enjoyed the ride.
Okay.
So I would just figured I'd ask these questions since you're going to get into Job and understanding his lineage, where he comes from, trying to understand things that are global in their culture. The other thing I
Yeah.
want to ask is um, maybe it's just something that's good for us to know because we're Americans and we live in the century we live in. Um, how do people regard themselves in terms of their organization socially, politically, meaning like family level, tribal level, the idea of a
Yeah.
nation state concept,
Yeah.
and the heritage or the lineage from which somebody descends, are those, I guess, what are the general implications that are just globally true regardless of what people or place you come from? Is there any normals in there?
Well, at that point in the ancient world and across humanity by default, people are tribal. They view themselves as part of a group, and almost invariably, I don't know of a single instance where people don't fundamentally see themselves that way, uh, where where like directly attached to that is the view that some people are the problem and some people are oppressed, where there isn't like a victim group and a problem group. Um, it's everywhere. There's a whole lot more that I could say about that, but I think, but the sense of people as individuals with individual responsibilities to the community, to the society, you don't really see that until the Mosaic Code, which does elevate the dignity of the individual person, uh, but situates individuals in relationship to one another. That's quite a bit different from just kind of scrapping your entire self identity down to a group. But people are basically tribal at that time, and they still are, apart from Revelation. Section 4, Job. And we'll close with this. Of special interest in this from this period is Job. It is a virtual certainty that Job lived during the patriarchal era, and while many have suggested a later date for the authorship of the book of Job, you can see, for example, the MacArthur Study Bible. It's at least possible, if not likely, that Job was the first book of the Bible to be penned. There are several clues in the Old Testament that may tell us when and where Job lived. And this is really interesting. There's not really very much practical value in this, or even in knowing it. I just think it's interesting. Uh, but first, Job was from Uz, which is in the east. And in the Old Testament, the east can refer to anywhere in the ancient Near East, east of the Jordan. Uh, and Job 42:17 in the Septuagint says that Uz is on the borders of Edom and Arabia. However, the Septuagint was produced around 200 BC. So we're talking, you know, up to a full 1,000 years almost after uh, after Job's time. But nearly all biblical appearances of the name Uz occur in Genesis or are placed in genealogies from the patriarchal period. Uh, they occur in early Genesis, by the way. So that's the first thing. Secondly, the genealogy in Genesis 10 demonstrates that many locations, as we all know, were named after those who originally settled those places. Uh, Third, and following that, Genesis 10, 21 through 23 tells us that there was a man named Uz who lived 6 generations back from Abram. He was the son of Aram, who in turn was the son of Shem. In other words, Uz was a grandson of Shem. You can scratch that second grandson there. And you can just compare those two passages I have there to see that. Shem, of course, is Noah's son. So Uz is the great grandson of Noah. Um, Fourth, the region of ancient Aram stretched from modern day Syria, north of Israel, to the area between the western ends of the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. That's up where Haran is. Haran, of course, is located in the northern part of Aram, between the Tigris and the Euphrates. And that was Abraham's hometown after his family's uh, migration. That should be family's possessive from Ur in eastern Mesopotamia. Fifth, we learn from Genesis 22:21 that Nahor, the brother of Abraham, he had a son named Uz. So Uz was a nephew of Abraham. Evidently, however, while Abraham migrated to Canaan after his call, Nahor, and we can assume his son Nahor's son Uz, remained in Haran. Okay, so Abram goes down to Canaan. His family stays in Haran. That includes his brother Nahor and Nahor's son Uz. So he's up there in that same region. Okay. Six, all the biblical data clearly shows that Uz was a Semitic name. It's just not associated with anybody else's line except for Shem's, and all instances of it appeared during that patriarchal period. Okay, so here's the conclusion, putting all that together. Job was likely a Semite and possibly even a distant relative of Abraham, and Uz, a city near Haran, named after Abraham's nephew who settled it, or maybe somebody else in the family who settled it. And since it might take multiple generations for a city to become established, at least established enough to support a wealthy man like Job, Uz may have been an important city later in the patriarchal era. So look, so you figure Abraham's nephew settles this city and it's named after him, Uz, and maybe it takes a couple generations or so for this city to kind of build up and get to the point where it can support a really wealthy guy like Job. So practically speaking, that puts you in like maybe the days of Jacob or even Joseph, right near the end of the patriarchal period. Okay, so in summary, it's at least reasonable to conclude that Job was a Semite from the family of Abraham who lived in Uz, which is near Haran, and that he was a contemporary of Jacob or Joseph. And that's my thought uh, about Job. Any thoughts or questions about that? Anybody have a different analysis of it, different theory? Okay. That's it, guys.
So I don't have a question, but just to add to that,
Yeah.
when you read Job, um, the scriptures in the book of Job never refers to God as Yahweh,
Yeah.
only as Shaddai, meaning that he was known at the time period before Moses, before he gave his name,
Hmm.
right? So it would also tell you that it's in the patriarchal period
Yeah.
prior to Moses.
Yeah. You know, something else that's interesting to me about Job, like it's kind of small chips, but it is interesting to my mind, and and it seems to me to kind of be a little bit of support for what I'm saying, is that Job talks several times about snow. And there are other places that do. I know the Hebrew word for snow appears like 19 times in the Old Testament, and there are several places in the Psalms, 4 or 5 places in the Psalms where it talks about snow falling. But you have again 4 or 5 instances of where snow appears in Job, where it's talked about as, it's described as a thing, and it's not being compared to something else, like your sins will be crimson, but they'll become white as snow. It's not talked about comparatively, but it's Job's talking about it as something that falls, or God is talking about it as something that falls in the later chapters of Job. And there's a that area, the region of Haran where Abraham's family settled. It's a really snowy region, a really snowy, cold area. And there's actually a city in modern day Turkey right in that area that is named Haran. And it's obviously a really ancient city, and it's snowy there. And I've always kind of wondered, like, I wonder if Job was from right around that region somewhere. Like pure speculation, speculation about speculation, but it's interesting. Okay, that's it. We're done.